All right, welcome everybody. Labor panel in the afternoon, after lunch. Always a challenge, but we've been promised a stimulating discussion on labor issues, and I'm going to turn it over to Kristen Disick, who's going to lead this panel. Kristen.
So I'm kind of looking forward to this discussion. I hope you are too. I'm Kristen Disick. I'm now with the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. So you may have known me from CAR, but I have moved just recently over to the Fed. And this morning's conversations, I was thinking about Marieke's research about these closed plants in Japan. And I'm from Flint, Michigan. I know closed plants pretty intimately. And I usually don't have to say much more than that. But one thing that I saw growing up in Flint, Michigan in the 60s, 70s, 80s was the power of the labor union to transform people's lives and the limitations of the labor union when big, huge changes come to this industry. And that's what we're facing right now and what we're going to discuss with our panel. This is really an industry. Oh, well, I should back up. We are, because I'm with the Federal Reserve, I have to say that nothing I'm saying is representative of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve System, the governors, the president, none of those people, it's me, just me. And there are some things that we will not talk specifically about on this panel, like bargaining goals or things like that. We really have, an integrated industry across North America that's building vehicles together. We have the US and Canadian markets requiring imports to meet demand, and Mexico as a net exporter. In the US, as many of you know, only GM, Ford, and Stellantis as the automakers are organized. In Canada, that is true as well. There's broader union coverage in Mexico, but it's a little different there. And we're going to get into that today. US manufacturing broadly was 7.6% unionized in 2021, down from 10.5 in 2011. It's a little higher in Canada, about 1 in 4 manufacturing workers are in a union. And in Mexico, it's quite a bit higher, though there's a big asterisk, I think I would put on Mexico's union rate. We have wages are fairly comparable in the US and Canada, but significantly lower in Mexico. And we're facing this big change of electrification. Early on, when electric vehicles first started being produced in the US, you can think of the Chevy Volt. The UAW made an agreement to represent the workers at Brownstown Battery Plant. And they made a special agreement outside of the national agreement to get those jobs in that new technology area. We're going to talk a little bit maybe about how that played out. And now we're facing not only new joint venture battery plants, but a new Ford plant in Tennessee and a whole lot of new entrants to this industry. Next year, in 2023, the UAW and Unifor go to the table for the first time in quite a long time that you're jointly negotiating with agreements that expire in September. And Mexico is in the midst of labor reforms and revoting representation elections, as Alex told us about yesterday. As you may know, back in 2007 was when we first saw in the UAW agreements second-tier wages. So an agreement that new workers would be making less. In Canada, they took a different approach of a 10-year grow-in to the top wage. So stretching out what was a 3-year grow-in, I believe, to 10 years. We had bankruptcy of 2 of the major companies, a mid-contract opener in 2009. And then in recent years, it's been a long time until 2019 before the incumbent workers, the workers who had been on roll before 2007, got a raise at all. We also saw a major change in basic elimination of the second tier, a set agreement of how temporary workers would become permanent under the new agreement. And when we look at next year's bargaining, both the UAW and Unifor will have new leadership in some form or fashion. The UAW has an election of 1 member, 1 vote for the first time in its history. the current incumbent president may continue to be president. We don't know that yet, but there's been resignations and retirements in the leadership. So there'll be new leaders within the UAW ranks, and the leadership of Unifor is turning over as well. Doing all of this in the midst of implementing the USMCA trade agreement, which we had a lot on yesterday on Greg's panel and others. You know, the required labor law reforms in Mexico and rapid response mechanism that's currently churning through the systems. The key thing I think there was that 40% of cars and 45% of trucks need to be made at an average wage of $16 an hour or more. And that was meant to be a hook to move more manufacturing into the US and Canada, but it may not necessarily play out that way. There's evidence and some in the press. There's a Honda supplier in Mexico that just raised their employees' wage to $16 an hour in Mexico. I think the other thing we can think about here is we have very different leaders at the top of our countries. The three countries have, at least in their outward communications, people who are pro-union leading the countries. So that, you know, has a layer in here too. There's a lot of big issues in 2023. There's job security and investment and compensation and profit sharing and COLA, and healthcare is always an issue, especially in the United States, pensions. But what we're going to focus on today are the challenges of electrification, the USMCA, which is CUSMA in Canada and TMEC in Mexico, and the overall labor union environment for organizing some of the new areas of this industry. I'm going to quickly go through the introductions of our speakers, and then they will follow me with brief opening remarks, and then we'll have a panel. If you do ask a question, I ask that you, during the panel, you come up here and speak loudly, because we do have a translator who's working with us for one of our panelists. So we need all questions to be clear and loud so that he can handle translating that. So first up, we'll have Jennifer Kelly. She's a UAW analyst with over 20 years of experience. She's been focused on growing the union's membership and organizing, and she is one of the key authors on the union's white paper around electric vehicles called Taking the High Road: Strategies for a Fair EV Future. She'll be followed by Angelo De Caro. He's the Unifor Research Director. Unifor is Canada's largest private sector union that represents automotive workers and the successor organization to the UAW in Canada. They broke away in the early 80s, back when I worked for the UAW. But he's been leading strategic and economic and policy research, auto policy, international trade, including consulting during the rounds of USMCA, CUSMA, TMEC negotiations. And finally, Wilibaldo Gomez Zupa. He is from Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico. That's how great my Spanish is. He's an economics professor there, and also a researcher at the Center for Labor Research and Trade Union Consultancy, or CILAS, and an economic advisor to Cintia, the independent national union in Mexico, that recently won representation at GM's Silao plant, which was high in the press just recently. So I'm going to start with Jennifer to come up to this podium for her introductory remarks.
Thanks, Kristen. I'm happy to be here with all of you. Kristen sort of highlighted so many issues, and it reminded me that at lunch we were just talking about there's so much going on right now, and it can be hard to disentangle it. And so while I'd love to touch on everything she raised, I'm just going to focus on the work that I've been doing with the UAW in the past couple of years. As Kristen mentioned, I've been with the UAW over 20 years in a research capacity. I've supported lots of bargaining, worked on policy, worked on trade, and really, maybe 5 years ago, tried to make sure that our membership, our leadership, really understood the coming EV transition. While we see it all around us now, 5 years ago, it wasn't in headlines the way it is today. And so we've been sort of trying to get our arms around how to think about the transition before it was even happening, and be prepared for making sure that the transition could be good for workers. And so that brings me to the work I'm doing today, which is looking at how to grow the union's membership, in particular, how to do that as the industry transitions. The last transition that I can really think of in the US industry was back in the early 80s, when we moved from being a completely unionized auto assembly market to one that started to become less unionized, to where we are today, where about half of the vehicles assembled in the US are union. And so that change in density has really changed worker bargaining power. We hear it at the bargaining table every time we sit down with the automakers. And you can also see it in the wages and working conditions in the non-union sector as well. And so as we are in the middle or the beginning of this transition to electric vehicles, we want to make sure that we get it right this time, so that when we find ourselves 10 years down the road in an industry where, you know, maybe half of the vehicles being sold are electric, that we're happy with how that has impacted workers. We see this as both an opportunity, but also really an obligation to make sure that this transition is a transition that isn't just giving us a sustainable environment, right? It is a very exciting time, and it's so important. I mean, climate change is just having devastating effects around the world. And so the role the auto industry can play is very important. But we have a broader vision of sustainability. It isn't just about zero emissions vehicles. It means sustainable jobs. And we see that as being good jobs with democracy for workers in the workplace, meaning they can freely form unions without fear of intimidation and harassment. It also means sustainability for the communities where these workers live and where these plants are located. So we want an all-encompassing view of a sustainable future. And we think that this is an opportune time to do it. First, there is a tremendous amount of taxpayer money flowing to the auto industry to enable this transition, whether it's subsidies for new plants that are coming online, whether it's consumer subsidies to purchase EVs, grants for battery plants, money for electric school buses. And I think that this is a chance to say, okay, that's fine. Those dollars can help support the private sector in making this transition, but we can get more out of those dollars by requiring that there are job standards and standards for the community as well. I think we should raise the level of expectations of what those taxpayer dollars get for people in this transition, so that it is a win-win-win, so that we achieve true sustainability. Again, this broader definition where it's not just about the environment, but it's about good jobs and healthy communities. I think secondly, it's important too, because if we think about big changes in industry, trade is maybe an example. If working people feel like the transition to a green economy actually means the loss of good jobs, the political support that we need to actually fund this transition, to do what we need to do to really try and slow climate change, will not be there. And so I think that there is a really strong political argument that we have to make sure that we don't make the mistakes that we've made before in leaving working people behind. And so that's another angle. And lastly, because the early signs of what the new auto industry might look like are a little discouraging. And I say that when I look at some of the battery plants that are already up and running in the United States. There's an LG Energy plant, there's Tesla, and the wages in those plants are significantly lower than the legacy propulsion plants. In other words, engine and transmission. So if we think about this transition away from engines and transmissions to batteries and motors, what we're seeing is a real degradation in the quality of those jobs as it exists now. The good news is there aren't many of them up and running yet. So we're not so far gone. There is an opportunity, and there's no reason why we shouldn't, just decide that the auto industry historically has provided really strong, high quality jobs. It's part of the reason states compete for these jobs and spend millions and millions in taxpayer dollars to subsidize the companies. But the reason that the jobs have been so good is because there was high union density, and union contracts had the effect of raising standards for everybody, not just the unionized workers covered under the contract, but across the industry. And if the density continues to decline, these jobs will not maintain this high quality. And I think as a nation, we should just decide that these are going to be good jobs. And again, with the taxpayer money that's flowing to them, we can make that demand. So that's the project that we have ahead of us. We see, again, lots of battery plants coming online. Some of them are joint ventures. To sort of get in the weeds of what that means for the labor movement, that means if I'm a worker at GM, Ford, or Stellantis, and I'm in an engine plant, and Ford or somebody else opens a joint venture battery cell plant, I can't just transfer to that plant the way contracts currently are. So that means that there is no soft landing. There is no just transition within that employer with my seniority at my existing wage. So the change in the industry structure as it's playing out in the United States is one that has real risks for working people. And the fact of the matter is it doesn't have to be that way. It isn't playing out that way in Europe. There are joint ventures, but because of national agreements, you earn what the occupation dictates you will earn. And so that low road approach is not playing out. And it doesn't need to play out here, and it shouldn't play out here. So what the UAW is doing is we are working at organizing. We're working with partners in the environmental movement. We've had probably the best relationship with environmental groups as we've ever had. We're working with racial justice communities who see that disproportionately Black workers have benefited from unions in the auto industry in particular. And so they see common cause with this effort as well. And so we want to paint this picture and make it clear what's at stake as this industry transitions and the importance of organizing it. So I think I'll leave it there and we can discuss more at the panel. Thank you.
Thanks so much, folks. And thanks to Kristen for organizing this panel and the GERPISA organizers too. This is the first time I've been at this conference, and for the short amount of time that I have been here, I've found it very interesting and a lot of rich discussion. So maybe this will be a habit as it becomes moving forward. I want to note Kristen too, because I don't know if folks maybe appreciate the political dynamics of this particular panel. I don't know that there's many cases where we're at a symposium or any other forum for that matter, where you've got a representative from United Auto Workers, Unifor, and an independent union negotiating with one of the Detroit 3 companies based in Mexico. This sort of tri-national linkage through the Detroit 3 is very unique. And I'm excited just to be here with both of you, just for that reason. I'm going to try to go through 3 just general topics. I'm going to just quickly talk about the auto sector as it stands in Canada today. I want to talk about some opportunities and challenges that this EV transition creates for our union. And then I want to look ahead and look at some forks in the road that are coming up 2023 and beyond. So just in terms of the auto sector in Canada, our perspective on this, just some common facts, I suppose, still widely considered the most lucrative of Canada's manufacturing sectors. It generates $16 billion of value added in the country, which represents about 10% of all manufacturing gross domestic product. It's got about 130,000 workers. Can go as high as 190,000, depends on how you count them. But it's still a significant employment industry for the country. For those who don't know, I'm sure many of you do, located mostly in central Canada, Ontario predominantly. Ontario is still, trying to suss out the numbers from the COVID period, but going back to 2018, still the second largest jurisdiction for auto production in North America. And we're home to 5 passenger vehicle OEMs, operating 8 assembly facilities across 10 unique production lines, as well as 4 powertrain facilities and about 1,000 independent parts suppliers. So this is a very significant sector. I'll give you some important context to my further remarks. That the overall jobs in the sector since 2001, there's a lot of reasons why 2001 is an important benchmark year. This was at a high mark of production for Canada around the time. But since then, we've seen a 30% drop in overall jobs in the sector. And that includes slightly higher when you look at assembly specifically. In that time, we've seen 5 assembly plant closures, 6 closures if you count the General Motors Oshawa plant, which then subsequently reopened, and I'll get to that, and 1 plant that came online, a greenfield site in that time. So this is sort of the context, an industry that has created a lot of instability. There's a lot of despair among workers about what the future of the sector would look like. I think that's a common thread that's run through a lot of our local unions and our members. In 2020, though, there's a bit of a change in the outlook, which is unique because it comes at a time when we did have to live through a very devastating closure of General Motors in Oshawa. We saw a very strong UAW contract ratified that included significant investments, and folks, and Kristen will know because I talked to her a lot about this. At the time, everyone in Canada was like, well, what's left? What's left on investment? Where are we going with our facilities? A lot of them had lots of question marks around them. And then we bargained in 2020, and electric vehicles was a centerpiece of that round of bargaining. And it sort of brightened the horizon. The reopening of General Motors Oshawa didn't hurt, but the EVs was really the piece. Since that time, Canada has secured $14 billion worth of new auto investments in a span of 18 months. There is promised life now into a lot of these plants that didn't have a future, or at least the one we could see. We even have a new battery plant that is going to be built in Windsor. It is a point in time that a lot of folks are looking at as a rebirth or a renaissance of the Canadian auto sector, again, after 20 and some odd years of decline and despair. The opportunities that this presents, I think there's obvious ones around the EV transition, and Jennifer talked a lot about that, made some really excellent points I agree with. Underlying it all is that it's a future. It's an opportunity to grow new jobs and sustain existing jobs. And 5 of the 8 assembly plants in Canada already have plans in the works or announced for electric vehicle mandates that will be coming in. It's also an opportunity because for Canada, it presents a new value proposition for our country. Anybody who's following Canada and our economic development and the politics will know that we've got well-established automaking infrastructure, but we've also got proximity to a lot of the critical minerals like nickel and cobalt and lithium and even aluminum that is needed in next generation vehicles. And so this is generating some interest about how Canada might leverage this opportunity. Workers, most importantly, are excited about this. They see a connection to the need to resolve this climate crisis that we're faced with and see future jobs on the horizon. They see themselves as a part of this. And this is building a political consensus, at least among our union, but it's growing quite widely. And it's also a moment where I would say we're starting as a country to flex the industrial policy muscles that have atrophied for so many years, because philosophically our governments thought that this was not something we need to worry about. But now we're seeing investment subsidies, strategic. We're seeing our ZEV mandates kind of intersecting with those investment strategies. we have a lot of ways to go. There is a lot of gaps still in this broader strategy. And we are trying to fill some of those in a forthcoming uniform auto policy that takes some inspiration from that wonderful paper that the UAW put out a couple of years ago. And this will be published shortly. But there's challenges, not just these opportunities. And one is recognizing that Canada is still a very foreign dependent country for automaking. We don't have a domestic OEM. The decisions that happen in Canada to our facilities are made in places like Michigan. They're made in places like Tokyo. We have champions within the country, but it's a different dynamic than other automaking nations. As Jen mentioned too, there's a bit of a risk mitigation going on as this transition is happening, and we're seeing companies more inclined to look at joint ventures and other ways of sort of sharing the risk and what that means for our collective bargaining, what that means for working conditions and wages is still an open question, and we have to resolve this. You know, whether in the long run we balance out headcounts with EVs and old internal combustion engines, the fact is right now, in the limited experiences we are seeing a cratering of jobs in the supply base. We have a plant in Ingersoll, our old GM Cami plant, that's transitioned to commercial vehicles. And by our headcount, we've seen approximately 750 uniform members either laid off or under notice of layoff because the stuff they build doesn't need to go into those new commercial vans. And we're going to have to resolve this as more and more plants start to transition. And then maybe the biggest risk I would say, and the challenge we have is that, you know, this is still early days and there's a lot of opportunities here that expectations about this transition won't pan out as we think they will. We don't know what the first kind of mass production, this generation of vehicles, kind of quality that's going to come out, whether consumers will buy into it, you know, how job sustainability will work. And even, you know, the question for environmentalists who seem to love the fact that the union is involved in this transition. I mean, we talk about where the power is going to come from. And, you know, we talk to our friends in power workers unions and they say, hey, you can put as many EVs on the road as you want. You knock yourself out. At some point, our grid is going to have to turn up the dial on heavily polluting fuel sources. We don't have enough sustainable energy to actually fuel this. These are things people don't want to really talk about right now because we're too excited about EVs. There's also the question that came up this morning about mining and where these projects are going to come from. In Canada, they're going to come mostly, you know, in new mines that currently don't build or generate those products, but they're also going to come on Indigenous territories. And there's going to be a big discussion about what that means for reconciliation, our First Nations and those communities. So there's a lot of work to do. I'm just going to quickly close off. I know I'm at my time here. Just very quickly, some forks in the road. We've got our bargaining that's coming up. We know that issues around wage inflation, new investments, how do we guard members who are now going to face downtime as plants retool? These will all be features in 2023 bargaining, and how we deal with them is going to be a big question about the success of that bargaining. The politics of our country is shifting. You know, right now in Canada, we've got this unique experience where you've got the federal government, the Ontario government working hand in hand. It's like lockstep, and it's working well. But we have new upstart politicians that could very well get elected in the next few years that take a different approach to how governments ought to invest in the auto sector. And that could kind of upend our plans. And then lastly, on trade strategy, Kristen mentioned it, is that there is a very unique period of alignment from Canada, the US, and Mexico about workers' rights and the role of trade policy. And I would say even from a point of view of Canada and the US, there's an open question about whether the trade strategy is going to be one of collaboration, the Biden-Trudeau joint critical minerals strategy and friend sharing and things like this, which I don't really know what they mean. But there's that approach. But then there's also the combative approach, which I think we've seen a bit of when the US introduces EV mandates, wants them to be built in the USA by union factories, and then conveniently keeps Canada out of that equation. That raises significant existential questions for our country. We don't know if that's the path we're going to have to resolve going down. And of course, I know Willibaldo will speak on the Mexico momentum and possible joint collaborations on a more trinational basis. So lots of fodder. I'll stop there and I will pass the floor to Willibaldo. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I used the translation are more faster the presentation and not confused. Bueno, yo soy un académico de la Facultad de Economía de la UNAM. Yo soy un académico de la Facultad de Economía de la UNAM. Pero hoy voy a presentar una actividad como activista por la libertad sindical en México. Como se decía hoy en la mañana, el profesor Covarrubias, hay como se decía hoy en la mañana, hay distintas tensiones, distintas trayectorias en tema ecológico, el tema de la nueva movilidad, de las nuevas energías. Y en el caso mexicano, tenemos un nuevo entorno institucional que atañe específicamente al mundo del trabajo. En el caso mexicano, el tema de los tratados de libre comercio tuvo como foco los bajos salarios que tenía el sector automotriz específicamente. Distintos acuerdos mercantiles, acuerdos comerciales, dieron como resultado una conformación perversa para los trabajadores. Esto orilló a que hacia 2017 fuera un tema para la renegociación del Tratado de Libre Comercio de América del Norte. Paralelamente se hizo también una reforma laboral en ese año que intentaba poner fin a estos abusos en contra de los trabajadores. Hay tres tendencias muy marcadas. Una, la total ausencia de democracia al interior de las representaciones sindicales. Dos, esto que se dio por llamar el dumping social de las empresas que producían en México y el no cumplir los estándares laborales. Evidentemente, como decía Ángelo, a pesar de que los tres países de América del Norte son socios, también hay competencia y en ese sentido había pérdida de volumen y calidad de empleos tanto en Estados Unidos como en Canadá. En el caso de la industria automotriz en México, la crisis de 2018 modificó aún más los esquemas laborales. Se introdujeron nuevas maquinarias, nuevos modelos de producción, se cambiaron las jornadas laborales a un modelo de 4 días laborables por 3 de descanso, con 12 horas por jornada laboral. Sin embargo, el sindicalismo no cambió, se mantenían estas estructuras autoritarias, déspotas que contenían las demandas salariales de los trabajadores. Hacia finales de la década pasada, este tipo de actitudes fueron creciendo de tal forma que llegaron a ser insostenibles en la planta de General Motors Silao. Entre 2018 y 2019 se despiden a más de 80 personas, 80 trabajadores que buscaban una nueva actitud del sindicato y que peleaban por ser escuchados dentro de la planta. Temas como el acoso laboral, acoso sexual, despidos injustificados, no pago de horas extras, descuentos injustificados, eran tema del descontento. En 2019 se conforma un colectivo entre trabajadores despedidos y trabajadores en activo que se llama Generando Movimiento por las siglas de la propia empresa. La organización lo que buscaba era ser escuchados y en ese sentido el apoyo que brindaron distintos sectores, incluido el académico o asociaciones civiles y los espacios internacionales fue determinante. Los despedidos eran la cara pública para mantener el anonimato de los trabajadores en activo y así no poder perder su empleo. La pandemia de COVID-19 lo que hizo fue incrementar los problemas que tenía el sector de trabajadores. En la empresa se dejaron de hacer pruebas a los trabajadores que resultaban infectados, no había un apoyo a las personas que resultaban infectadas e incluso cuando las personas morían, la empresa solamente entregaba algo así como $4 o $5 por trabajador o familiar fallecido.
So they didn't provide any testing and didn't provide equipment for the workers. And then if somebody died, they gave them like $4 or $5 in support.
Esto incrementó el descontento y fortaleció la organización, haciendo que el colectivo Generando Movimiento creciera rápidamente.
And that gave the support for this new movement called Generando Movimiento, generating movement, and that got to become popular because of it.
En ese proceso se abrió los nuevos espacios del marco institucional laboral y la legitimación del contrato colectivo estaba planeada para el mes de abril de 2021.
And the union stipulated the date of the legitimization of the new collective bargaining agreement on April 20th and 21st.
Tanto la empresa como el sindicato empezaron a intimidar a los trabajadores, haciendo que el descontento creciera más.
And both the workers and the union were kind of making the workers even more angry and made the movement grow faster.
El día de las elecciones nos presentamos acreditados por la Secretaría del Trabajo, 3 observadores, a los cuales nos retiraron con lujo de violencia un grupo de golpeadores del sindicato de la CTM.
And the voting day, there were lots of issues that were found during the voting.
El resultado fue la anulación de este proceso electoral, pero ahí hubo un espacio muy importante para la solidaridad internacional, ya que por primera vez se abrió un panel de discusión dentro del Tratado de Libre Comercio.
So the voting actually got suspended, but it opened up for a panel where we could have more discussions and figure out a way forward.
Esto obligó al sindicato y a la empresa a hacer un nuevo proceso de legitimación del contrato colectivo, en donde la CTM, el sindicato titular, siguió, incrementó las amenazas hacia los trabajadores.
And that led to even more, even from the union side, to more intimidation and coercion towards the workers.
Por su parte, el colectivo Generando Movimiento incrementó el estudio y el contacto con los trabajadores, dando información no solo de lo que sucedía en la planta, sino lo que sucedía en otras plantas automotrices del país con sindicatos independientes.
And the workers worked together and worked with other plans to make sure that all the workers knew about the new movement.
El resultado es que una mayoría vota en contra de ese contrato colectivo, teniendo finalización el 3 de noviembre.
And the result was that it was voted down on November 3rd.
10 días después de la votación, el sindicato independiente, el Cintia, logra su registro y aparece públicamente para demandar la titularidad del contrato colectivo en la planta General Motors Silao.
And 10 days later, Cynthia was established and voted in by the people.
En febrero de este año, el 1 y 2 de febrero, se realizó la votación para elegir a sindicato titular, y en esta elección el sindicato independiente logra el 85% de la aprobación de los trabajadores.
On February 1st and 2nd, the vote is held and Cynthia gets more than 85% of the votes to be established at GM and Sinaloa.
¿Cuáles son los resultados de la representación auténtica? Hay una negociación real entre los trabajadores salidos de la línea de producción con los gerentes de recursos humanos.
There's been a negotiation between the new union and the company.
El resultado también es que la empresa no estaba preparada para negociar, se tuvo que llegar hasta los gerentes del corporativo a nivel nacional, porque los representantes de recursos humanos de la planta no querían reconocer a los trabajadores con las demandas que estaban presentando.
The negotiations had to go all the way up to the national leaders of those companies because human resources was not recognizing the workers.
Finalmente, se lograron obtener mejores salarios, beneficios en el contrato colectivo como prestaciones, más días de vacaciones para todos los trabajadores de General Motors Silao.
In the end, we negotiate better salaries, benefits, and other improvements like more vacation days.
En términos generales, nuevamente el sindicato estaba obligado a legitimar el contrato colectivo, lo cual sucedió los días 25 y 26 de mayo, en donde 6,331 trabajadores participaron, dando el 85% su aprobación a este contrato colectivo.
And the legitimization of the contract took place on May 25 and 26, and 86.5% of the 6,331 workers participated.
El incremento es un incremento histórico en el caso de la industria automotriz mexicana, porque junto a los salarios y las prestaciones se logró un 13.5% de incremento en el contrato colectivo.
And this was a historic agreement because it was a global increase of 13.5%, which is unique for the industry.
¿Cuáles son las lecciones? La primera, más importante, es que hay un cambio que ayuda mucho, un cambio institucional que ayuda mucho a los trabajadores en el entorno laboral mexicano.
So what were the lessons? One was that was a big change in the labor model.
Sin embargo, a pesar de que existe este cambio institucional, es necesario incidir en el factor subjetivo que siguen siendo los trabajadores para que conozcan sus derechos, conozcan los alcances del nuevo tratado comercial y de la reforma laboral que se aprobó en México.
There's still a lot to do, and we have to make sure that on the subjective side, that the workers know their rights and what they can do.
Que nuevamente es fundamental tener los ojos sobre los procesos de organización y los procesos laborales que se están abriendo en México para una transición laboral justa.
And it's important that we monitor the conditions of the labor relations and work towards a better future.
Gracias.
There's a big question, so I will not suck up all the time on this. I'll say a couple of things. What transpired in the new USMCA, I think all unions can agree, this does not reflect the sort of fair trade alternative model trade agreement that a lot of groups like ours, UAW and others have agitated for over the course of a generation. CUSMA is not that. USMCA is not that. What it is it at least in key areas tried to break ground on things that historically we thought were not possible to break ground on. And I think the restructuring of auto rules and content requirements was something that was very unique. The fact that there is a condition in those auto rules to say that there is some degree of a wage threshold that will be tagged into rules of origin is something that, at least in Canada, we don't have in any other trade agreement. I'm not sure of any trade agreement that has comparable provisions. So it's moving something forward on a principle that we've long supported. It's still too early to determine how that is going to play out effectively, although we've seen some positive outcomes in small cases. On the labor front, this, in the same vein, was an example of how we can take a very specific problem that was trying to be dealt with by Mexico domestically, and then use the power of a trade agreement and sanctions of trade to embolden the effort to reform what was an unreformable, very corrupt labor process in that country. And so on both those fronts, it's a very kind of interesting experience in where we're going to go. The last thing I'll say, just focused on the Mexico piece, because I think there's been more progress in the last little while on that front, and a lot of people are talking about it, is that, and we referenced this in our opening comments in a few cases, it's great now. There's a lot of attention on how we use these tools at our disposal to support this effort. But it's important to know that the effort is time limited. Like I don't think Mexico in their construction of labor reform said, yeah, we're just going to labor reform ourselves for the next 20 years. And eventually we'll get all these contracts fixed up. Like they gave themselves like 4 years to figure this out. The problem is that there's not enough contracts that have gone through the revote process, that it's raising a question to say, well, can we stop this process now or must it continue because the job's not done? So that's a political question that we'll see what happens in the coming years. There's also the political question of you've right now got a US government who is gung-ho. There is not a complaint that comes across their desk that they are not taking and just running with. USTR is just emboldened to take these claims on. There seems to be allies in the AMLO government that they want to have that support. And Canada, I will say sheepishly, we're sort of standing up there in the north going, hey, that's great, and we'll hitch our ride to what the US is doing, but we haven't filed a complaint. We haven't really done anything on this front. But there's philosophical political alignment. That will not be the case in the next few years. And that raises a question about where is the political spirit and emphasis behind what's happening. I'm not going to hold my breath that we're still having these big wins. I could very much see a situation where this becomes old news, less appetite, and we're not seeing the same level of engagement. And that would be a real danger. And I think that's where it's incumbent on unions to use these tools and to sustain them, because we're the key voice in being able to do that. And so I guess that I don't want to put a damper on everything, but that's just the sobering reality of where this whole USMCA kind of business is at. So maybe others have different views, but.
I agree with what Angelo said, and I guess I would just make this comment. When the Trump administration was looking to redo NAFTA and work on USMCA, the point that we tried to drive home with the USTR is these companies are in Mexico to exploit labor. Capital is mobile across borders, labor is not. And so that's what's going on here. This isn't a matter of General Motors, Volkswagen, BMW being in Mexico to serve the market. They're there to exploit labor. And so there needs to be a way to address that exploitation, because it not only hurts the Mexican workers, it hurts workers in the US and Canada as well. And so that's where you see some of the provisions that were put into the USMCA, but as Angelo pointed out, it can't do everything. We are in a good moment where there's some movement. The contract with General Motors is very exciting, but there's a lot more to do. And Mexican workers need a lot more power, which is to say workers throughout North America need more power.
So much for the handheld mics. I do want this section of conversation to be about USMCA. Alex, do you have a question? Please. So we'll stay focused on USMCA. We will move then to electrification questions. So knock yourself out.
Thank you for your great presentations and information. I wonder, there should be a way, you said. Can you elaborate a little more? What is that way to get in there? I see that USMCA, and I say it's a step forward in terms of tying labor compliance to trade. It's a great thing right now. It's a completely try to introduce a new game. What is that is missing, I wonder? How can we consolidate and expand this kind of trade? Also, besides this, you say, and you are right, the administration, the government is putting a lot of money, in all this transition, But it's crazy when we see the electrical Mustang going to Hermosillo. I mean, I'm Mexican, but I mean, probably some Mexicans say, what is wrong with you? Right? No, I'm North American or international. It doesn't make any sense. So what can you do about it, exactly?
So I'd be interested to hear what the other panelists might have to say. I'm not really sure what we do. I think that, you know, as Angela said, labor unions should continue to push so that we can get the most out of this moment. And I think we just have to keep raising awareness and push for more transparency, more sticks in our trade relations. I'm not really sure, and I'm not an expert in trade by any means, so that's where if either of you have something to say, but it clearly is a problem, and it's a problem of an asymmetry of power, and that's a big problem to fix. It's more than a trade problem. You know, I think it's a capital versus labor problem.
Sí, es una cuestión, un gran problema, ¿no? No es una solución fácil.
It's a big problem. There's no easy solution.
Yo lo que me he dado cuenta es que dejando los espacios con libertad, los sindicatos con libertad, los trabajadores tienen mucho que decir porque son los que conocen el proceso.
Unions have a lot of liberty, but it's the workers that really know all the conditions.
Al final de cuentas también es un tema de rentabilidad y los trabajadores son conscientes de eso. Nadie quiere perder su trabajo. Se estructuran mundos de vida a partir de ese trabajo.
At the end of the day, it's the way to make a profit, and the workers know that too. Nobody benefits if there's no profit.
Y hoy lo que podemos ver es que en Estados Unidos y Canadá hay representaciones de trabajadores que tienen algo que decir. Desgraciadamente en el caso mexicano no, porque los sectores mayoritarios están pensando otra cosa.
In the US and Canada, the unions are speaking up more. In Mexico, they're really concerned with other things right now.
Y este cambio institucional hoy brinda la posibilidad de que ese actor aparezca. Es un gran reto y creo que hay que tomarlo.
And that gives us the opportunity for this sector to come out and do this change, and that's the challenge we face.
Y evidentemente esto no es una respuesta al gran cuestionamiento, pero es simplemente una reflexión para aportar.
And there's really no easy answer, but just some reflections on this big question.
Gracias.
Thank you.
I had the luxury of an extra few seconds to think about things, so I'm gonna give you a couple of ideas. So there's a number of things that you raised. I'm gonna try to organize this carefully here. So on the labor, on the what do you do about the labor piece, I can tell you that the USTR, not that I'm not American, but I follow what the USTR says and what they do, have already been sending signals that this novel rapid response labor mechanism is likely going to formulate itself into new template approaches to forthcoming trade relationships with the US. Now, the catch to that is that I'm not sure that the US is really in any position to launch formal negotiations with any country. They seem to be just into framework mode and dialogue mode. So who knows where that's going, but we have followed that signaling very closely in Canada. In Canada, I can tell you that just last week, I was in meetings with officials of global affairs having discussions about this mechanism. And you cannot just simply export it word for word and say, now it applies to Indonesia, or now it applies to the United Kingdom. It very specific catering to the situation in Mexico. It's obvious. But there's principles in the mechanism that can be expanded and exported. And there is a desire, because unions are calling for it, to find a way to weave this into Canada's template language as well. So where this goes is still unclear, but there is a desire to take this and move it forward. And I can tell you too, colleagues of ours in the EU who do trade policy, mostly unions, folks who are kind of on the progressive side, are very keen to know this model, and not just the model itself, but the fact that the USMCA took the May 10th agreement, which drives kind of template labor trade policy in the US, and they started fixing this leaky boat. They started taking away provisions that were useless and proven useless, tidying it up, making it stronger. And now we're seeing the ramifications of that as that becomes the new template for labor chapters, including proper sanctions on people who break the laws and who violate the trade terms. So this is happening and this is good, but it's very early days. The other piece I think that matters is that there needs to be a sustaining of a cross-border solidarity. And I was not working on these files back in like the mid-90s, but I listened to people who were, and there was certainly momentum in the NAFTA and this side chapter, the NALC, on labor rights that spurred a tri-national movement. A lot of NGOs that still exist today were a byproduct of that collaboration. But I think there's only so many times you can bang your face against a brick wall to realize that what we're doing here is pointless, that momentum died down. This is like a resurgence of that momentum. And the difference is that we're winning. Like we're actually seeing tangible wins. So I think it's incumbent on trade unions, despite the political shifts and the tailwinds and all that, we have to maintain these relationships and build the solidarity, because the mechanisms will stay there and we just have to work with them. And, you know, our union is involved in a large technical assistance project in Mexico, supporting Cynthia, supporting independent trade unions. I know the US government has also put in a lot of money to do this. And these projects are starting to slowly kind of collaborate, work together. And that to me is a really good thing, because that will sustain some of the momentum, and we need to see that. And then lastly, on Hermosillo and Ford, I mean, the one thing that we know is that right now, it's not exactly the most profitable thing to be making an electric vehicle. And there's a lot of question marks about where the supply chains are gonna land. And so I don't know how to put Hermosillo into context, but I do know there seems to be a greater appetite for the later mandates that are being announced to be slotted in the traditional regions like the Great Lakes and maybe parts of the southern US. And I think that might eventually come at the expense of more EV products going into Mexico. But that's just hypothetical. So I think there's still a story to be told about why the Mustang there, why. And then the other thing, which Kristen can talk better than anybody about, is the sustaining trends in the industry about global platforms, very flexible platforms. That's also a key piece about how this is all going to shake out across North America. And I don't know that we have all the answers to that just yet. So I throw those into the next step.
Well, and that's a preview of my presentation tomorrow. It's about global platforms and that. And there's, you know, the Mustang Mach-E is not the last or EV to be made in Mexico. There are other companies have announced products that are currently made in Mexico will electrify. We don't expect that they will change production location to do so. So there's still another Ultium battery plant to land somewhere too. So that is still in the mix for General Motors that plans to electrify Equinox and Blazer, which are currently made in Mexico. Bruce, did you have a question?
USMCA has a lot of different provisions, and some of the big issues, as Jennifer was saying, has to do with the power issue. And I wanted to ask Will Lobato if about the $16 an hour wage. Can you ever imagine a time when Mexican workers will actually receive $16 an hour? What is it now? $5 an hour? $3 an hour? $3 an hour. Can you imagine a time when they would actually get to that? Then what happens to trade agreement in terms of what happened and what's going to happen because of that? Now that's more, not necessarily his question, but that's for Jennifer and Angelo. But can you, Ubaldo, can you see that?
Sí, es difícil imaginarlo en el corto plazo, que se lleguen a los $16 la hora.
It's hard to imagine that we'll get to $16 in the short term.
Aunque tenemos una inflación galopante que está entre el 7 y 8%, que muy seguramente los $16 van a ser en unos años los $3 que están percibiendo.
But with the galloping inflation we have, the $16 would probably be reached in a few years just by that.
Y finalmente tiene que ver con un tema de mercado. Si las empresas siguen siendo rentables, se puede llegar a esos $16 la hora. Lo que tengo claro es que con el sindicalismo corporativo no se va a llegar nunca a los $16.
It's hopefully the market condition and the profits allow that would be great, but I don't see it happening with the current union structure.
Es por eso que para pensar un futuro en donde un solo mercado como el de Norteamérica tenga salarios similares, es necesario fortalecer a los trabajadores para que puedan tener demandas cotidianas y muy similares.
You would hope that the market like North America, if everything is more standardized, that there would be a time where we can have all very similar conditions.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Well, I mean, my hope would be if you have auto workers making $16 an hour, there's sort of an effect that spreads through other sectors of the economy. And certainly if you're getting it in assembly and then parts. So perhaps you have a virtuous circle there and the demand for autos in the country grows. And then you can sustain a domestic industry. And so you'll have companies locating in Mexico to produce because they're selling in Mexico, not because they're exploiting labor.
I just wanted to share a quick story that doesn't get at the specific question because I don't even want to begin to prognosticate on like where wages will go. But Will Ubaldo's right. If inflation keeps up for another few months, might exceed $16 an hour. But just to show you maybe the tendency of a company like General Motors. It just happens to be the example at General Motors now, but I'm sure this applies to any multi-jurisdictional, OEM that's operating. But that plant in Silao, that plant, I always explain it to people that was the birth child of NAFTA. Like it came into being in 1996. NAFTA was struck in 1994. They built trucks. Trucks are the most lucrative, profitable product that these companies sell. And yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. With the tariff. And so the intent always, as others had said, was to use Mexico as the platform to ship these cars, into parts of the US and as an export kind of driven strategy. Not that Mexicans were gonna buy, Silverados and Sierras and all that. But as someone who has spent time, as others have, at the bargaining table, and it's a bit unfair because bargaining is its own beast and it has its own context. But, it's not surprising to anybody in this room that when we build those exact trucks at the now closed Oshawa truck plant, which closed in 2007, around that time, or that's when the announcement was, they said, we're going to move that production, that volume to Silao. So there's this Canadian connection with that facility. And every time we go to the bargaining table with many companies, they whip out a chart and they say, this is how much you cost us with your wages and your pensions and your childcare and your benefits and all this stuff. And this is what Mexico charges us. And I mean, without having to dive into all the numbers and where they come from, you just see a very lopsided chart, and then it sends a power signal to say, you Unifor/CAW, you got to wake up, you got to shape up. Because if you think that we can compete with your wages against building those exact trucks in Silao, you got another thing coming. And that creates fear, that creates a depression on how much we can advocate for at the table, and unions doing their job as a distributive force for wealth and income for people, right? So that mitigates that. That's obvious. What's not obvious is when Cynthia was at the bargaining table, the first time an independent union sat down with that company to bargain a new contract in Mexico, we were in close collaboration, working in solidarity. We weren't at the table, but if they needed something, they would call me, they would call Shane, they would call Dino, and they'd say, can you help explain things to us? Because they're making arguments that we don't understand. And after 30 years of listening to why Silao needs to be the drain on Oshawa workers at GM, we were getting requests from the folks at Cynthia saying, well, GM is now threatening us at the bargaining table, saying that if we don't temper our wage demands, they're making $3 an hour. So if we don't temper those wage demands, what's going to happen is, since Oshawa's back up and running now, well, you guys are going to, you're going to lose all this work because we're going to ship it off to Oshawa. So 30 years later, it's just a complete role reversal, but it's just an irritating example of the power dynamic at play and how Mexico has for years been the scapegoat in this. And I think now, and even the engagement of the Unifor GM Bargaining Council through these discussions, it's opening eyes to say, it's not about us. It's not about us versus them. It's about us together dealing with a company that has one objective, and we have to work together to solve it. So I just wanted to share that. Thanks. Oh, yeah, well, yeah, following our last contract, I mean, we're talking an hourly wage in Oshawa. We're tipping at production workers at about $37 an hour. And the trades are much higher than that. So yeah, that's Canadian. That's right. That's right. Yeah. Factor in the dollar. But no, that is exactly right. It's yeah.
Well, I think this gives us a nice transition to talk about electrification for a little bit. So low-cost country content has been a part of automotive manufacturing in every region of the world. Sometimes that low-cost country is the country where the vehicle is made, in China or in Vietnam and other places, but oftentimes it's reliance on a nearshore option. When we are looking at these dynamics in electrification, I want to hear more about Jennifer, you talked about the existing battery plants paying much less. The joint ventures are not union and attempt to pay much less. Even the Brownstown battery initial agreement was for a much lower wage to capture this new industry, this new work. Is this something that needs to be done in collaboration with low-cost country content? Or is there leakage outside of North America? Or can these vehicles can really be made without that compromise? I mean, if they're going to Silao and beating them up with Unifor wages, then, what is the next battering ram in this area where there are new companies, new entrants, new joint ventures, new suppliers, all sorts of folks coming in that aren't union at all. So Why don't we dive into the electrification competitive environment? You want to start?
So I think that in terms of batteries, again, I'm going to look to what we're seeing in Europe, where I don't think you're seeing that there is a demand for lower wages in battery cell production, battery pack assembly. And just to get into the weeds a little bit, I mean, there's sort of two pieces of battery work from sort of an auto worker perspective. There's making the battery cells, which have been done in Asia by and large. That's where most of the capacity is. And so EVs so far have quite often imported the cells and then done pack assembly near the assembly plant. These are bigger and it's more to move and whatnot. And so there are a number of assembly plants that will do battery pack assembly. And what I think is interesting is that, you know, you see some companies who want to push to say, oh, well, that work isn't worth as much as auto assembly work. And they want to get that done at a lower wage. And so again, it's using the excuse of this new technology and, oh, we couldn't possibly do it at our existing wage because EVs are so expensive and they're hard to sell and all sorts of nonsense like this. But what I found really interesting is if you look in Alabama, which again, not a state where workers have a lot of power, Mercedes, when they're standing up their battery pack assembly facility, they went and they found their best auto assembly workers, put them through training like no other these workers have seen before, like real training and tests and then more training, and paid them the exact same wage they were making on the assembly line. This was like work they saw as very important and requiring skill. BMW, according to press reports, was doing the same thing. So there is not a single model out there, and there's every reason to believe that the battery work is high value added work. And companies that are choosing to try and take a low road on it are purely just trying to see what they can get away with. So that's the perspective that I see. We know that labor is a very small piece of the battery in terms of cost, which means you can raise the rate on labor without changing the price equation on the vehicle that much. So I'm not exactly answering your question of do we need to go low cost country, but the evidence suggests that there is a path among the major automakers that does not pursue a low road. And so it's obviously possible.
Yeah, I on this, there's very little. I disagree with them, what Jen has said. To me, it's standard practice at a point of disruption that the ground is shifting. There's arguments to be made about why what we're shifting to is fundamentally different than what is now. And that's sort of like that's the argument, or that's the basis for the argument for some of these really old-fashioned corporate strategies to try and reduce costs where they can. I mean, like, you know, I think it kind of goes without saying. I think, as I mentioned in my earlier remarks, that this is also being couched as a bit of like risk management. Hence, you don't have OEMs necessarily jumping feet first into some of these new factories that are being built. I think of not just the batteries, the cell manufacturers, which are pretty much all joint ventures. I don't know about Tesla and their relationships, but I just assumed that they do have that, but certainly on Stellantis and certainly on General Motors and Ford, this will be the case. So you can argue, like they have argued in past, 1988, when GM and Suzuki started a joint facility in Ingersoll and said, GM is different. This time it's different, right? And 30 years later, we're now like back at parity. We're still working how to stitch it all back together. It's the same logic that underpins two-tiering. It's all of that. And so it's unions having to gut check to figure out how we're gonna combat this. And this goes even further as GM and companies like POSCO are coming up with new, cathode materials and all of this new supply chain work is going to be in that same vein. So I expect more of it, and it's going to be a challenge. I have no doubt. So,
Answer this question too.
okay.
You get the first crack at this. So there's a new Stellantis investment in Kokomo, Indiana, in a battery plant. Kokomo, Indiana is where Stellantis makes every transmission they make in North America. And they have an engine plant there as well. So this is a very highly concentrated Stellantis community. And they put a big joint venture battery plant there. The article that I found this morning is the local union president. If they're building that in our backyard, just right across from the engine plant, right down from ITP, the transmission plant, we have to look at every battery that goes in and out that door. That's one less engine and transmission they're going to need. And this is all in an article where he's going to, put on notice that Stellantis must organize this plant. And of course, there's a statement from the Stellantis public relations saying, well, if the workers want to organize, they can. But we have workers at risk too in this transformation, engine and transmission workers who are highly unionized. Can you talk a little bit, and it's throughout the supply chain, can you talk a little bit about that workers at risk transition here and what, how unions are approaching that?
Yeah, I can certainly try. So okay, I'm going back to my last point about risk mitigation, corporate strategies. This is a key feature of an explanation of some of the decisions that they make. I also think when it comes to the question of recognizing a union, especially in a joint venture that has involved a traditional unionized automaker in North America, that they will see a defiant approach to say, hey, this isn't what you guys think it is. So if you think you can represent these workers, you have at it. But we're not gonna do anything different. We're not gonna let you kind of waltz in here. Like they could very well take that approach, and and Jen can speak to this better. But we watched very closely the very public shit fight between the UAW and General Motors and the Ultium battery, where that very much was General Motors' opening gambit, was to say, this isn't master bargaining. This isn't the traditional Detroit 3. UAW has no claim to what we're doing here. And that prompted a very, very visceral response from the union. And then that got tempered and that changed, that tone changed. So my guess is that they will make that calculation, but that is very different than them saying, we'll accept you, but don't expect comparable working conditions. Don't expect the stuff that you folks have gotten used to. That very much can play into this. And that is part of the risk. The other part of the risk is this question, and what Kristen just laid as an example articulates it well. We've got, as I mentioned, 4 major powertrain facilities in Canada. Some of those powertrain facilities seem to have a very long future because, as we all know, flipping the switch on EVs doesn't mean that tomorrow everyone's buying EVs. We're going to be making big engine trucks for quite some time. And our folks in Windsor, for instance, build those engines. They build Godzilla engines, they're called. They're massive. And they make lots of money. And as the company and others realize that a lot of that profit is helping to fuel the EV transition. It's all kind of working in tandem, and the same is true in General Motors. We have other powertrain facilities, like in St. Catharines, where that level of security is not there. And there are open questions about what is going to happen. We've broached the idea of, well, does existing powertrain facility, is it conducive to flipping into battery cell production? And the more we learn, the more we realize that that's a challenging proposition. But there are other new component parts in electric vehicle motor systems and e-powertrains that very much can synchronize with existing powertrain facilities. And so the question for us is, how do we force those conversations to be had? How do we make sure that these facilities building very lucrative, profitable engines going into very profitable cars aren't just paying for the transition through profits and then being left to die, but there is a cycle back plan for them to say, here are the new products that will be coming in. I'd like to say that we have examples of how this is working. We don't, because this is still very new. And as Kristen in her previous role and other work done by auto sector analysts have pointed out very gravely to me, is that any of the preliminary forecasts about EVMS production, zero is allocated to Canada currently. And that has us very concerned. But that is going to be another topic that certainly gets brought to bargaining tables and conversations. So.
I know we're very short on time, and so I'm just going to make 2 points that hopefully will give you some ability to sort of think about what the companies are doing on your own. First, I mean, we've all heard about dog whistling. Well, the analogy within labor to dog whistling is to say, we're going to let the workers choose. We read that as a very anti-union sentiment, which means that we're not going to agree to a fair process and full neutrality and just let the workers have majority sign up. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, today, if an assembly plant closed in the Stellantis system, formerly known as Chrysler, those workers would have rights to transfer to another facility within the system. Their jobs would be protected in some respects, and they'd have recall rights. By setting up a battery plant across the street under a slightly different name and saying, well, that's not Stellantis, that means that transfer. So all those workers in Kokomo, they can't go across the street without severing with the company, which means if they've got 20 years in, that's gone if they want to keep a job making propulsion systems for the company. So I'll leave it at that.
So we have run out of time. We do have a little transition before the next section, and the panelists have agreed they're going to stick around at least for that. I know that Angelo and Willibaldo are going to be around throughout today. Jen is going to leave. So if anybody has any direct questions, please come on up. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention to this panel.